Have you ever heard the tale of a man born unable to scream? Not from fear or a sudden shock, but because he entered the world without a tongue, in a place where family ties twisted back on themselves like a hangman's knot. He had only 7 fingers in total, 3 on his left hand and 4 on his right, all shriveled and useless, curled inward. He was never given a proper name, only a nickname whispered like a curse, ***, the craw ***. And if you're hearing this, it's because you've strayed from the beaten path, because this story isn't found in books. It's passed down in hushed tones among fractured families in parts of the world so forgotten that even the census takers gave up. Deep in the hills of eastern Tennessee, past the reach of power lines or any road you'd trust your tires on, there once stood a house. It looked less like it was built and more like it had been vomited up by the very ground it stood on. The craw was born there in 1942, inside a home of rotted wood and kin who had lost track of their own bloodlines. Some say his mother was also his sister. Others claim she wasn't human at all, just the last sane mind in a family spiraling into madness. Doctors never saw him, and the town never knew he existed. But the holler did, and it listened. People swear he still made noises, deep, wet sounds from his throat, like an animal trying to mimic speech. And when they say he had no tongue, they don't mean it was removed, they mean it was never there to begin with, just a smooth patch of pink flesh where a lifetime of words should have formed. His fingers were bent like twigs that had been left in water for too long. But what truly haunted the old women who spoke of him wasn't his appearance. It was the way the forest would fall silent whenever he passed. They say he lived longer than anyone expected, maybe too long. Long enough to watch every member of his bloodline either vanish or decay from the inside out. No one ever taught him shame, yet he wore it like a physical weight sewn into his spine. You must understand, this isn't just a horror story made for entertainment. This was a real man. And the more you learn about him, the more you realize he should never have been. They say his grandfather built the house with his bare hands and rusted nails, not out of pride, but out of paranoia. Every window was small, every door so low you had to bow your head to enter. The house was a cage, designed to keep outsiders out and the family's blood in. The craw was born into silence, but he wasn't alone. There were others, 3 uncles, 2 aunts, and a mother who aged at twice the normal rate. No birth certificates, no school records, just a family that consumed each other's memories until they forgot where one person ended and another began. Neighbors, if you could even call them that, would sometimes hear guttural thumps from the hills at night, as if something large and limping moved just beyond the tree line. Once, a boy hunting raccoons discovered a pile of bones arranged in a perfect spiral. Most thought they were goat bones, but one had a gold filling still wedged in the molar. No goat ever wore gold. It was in this den of chaos that the craw became something else. He couldn't speak, but he watched from the corners, from behind trees. Children who wandered too close to the property would come back pale and trembling, whispering about a man with no eyes, not blind, just empty, as if the sockets had caved in from lack of use. But that was the strange thing. Everyone saw something different. Some swore his mouth stretched from ear to ear like torn skin. Others claimed he had no mouth at all. Hallucinations, most likely, but every account ended the same way. I felt like I was being remembered. In '67, one sheriff tried to investigate. He drove up with 2 deputies and a pistol full of bravado. What came back was the car, empty and still running. There was no sign of a struggle, just a trail of footprints leading into the woods and none coming out. Official reports said they'd run away, but the sheriff's wife swore he'd left his wallet behind, something he never did. That's the issue with stories like this, they become frayed and warped. But if you sit still long enough, the truth finds its way back. After that disappearance, the townsfolk began using the term the craw more seriously, not as a simple nickname, but as if it were a role, a position passed down in the shadows. As if the man hadn't been born deformed, but had been chosen to be that way. By the 1970s, the house had crumbled in on itself, as if the land itself was rejecting what had lived there. But the craw remained. Neighbors who dared to walk near the property reported catching glimpses, quick flashes of a figure sitting motionless among the debris. There was no roof, no walls, just a man-shaped void barely visible through the trees. He never moved. He never waved, but you could feel his stare like a nail pressing into your spine. Of course, there were rumors. That he survived on raw animals, that he'd somehow bred with something else in the woods, that he was cursed, a punishment for his family's sins. The local preacher called him a demon in human skin. But there was no proof, only fear. A quiet fear that makes you cross yourself when you're alone, even if you've never believed in anything before. One 17-year-old girl decided to prove it was all just superstition. She brought a Polaroid camera and crept up the hill in broad daylight. Her boyfriend waited at the bottom with the car engine running. She never came back down. A week later, the sheriff found her camera on a stump near the property line. Only one picture had developed. It was mostly trees, but in the far right corner, crouched low behind a fallen log, was something pale, almost human except for the fingers, long and wrong. The image was filed away as police evidence, but copies spread through whispers. It became a rite of passage for local teenage boys: find the photo, stare at it long enough, and see if it stares back. Some swore the image changed over time. The figure seemed to creep closer. The shadows shifted. It was probably a trick of the light, but some swore on their fathers' graves that the photo would bleed when touched. People moved away. Families sold their land for pennies. The roads crumbled, overgrown with roots and silence. By the 80s, that part of the county was gone from official maps. Not condemned, not restricted, just erased. And yet, hunters still spoke of sightings. And sometimes late at night, you'd hear it, a sound like wet paper tearing. Not a voice, not an animal, but something in between. Because the craw didn't die. He never left. He just waited. You'd think someone like that, disfigured, isolated, half-myth, would simply vanish. But in 1992, a construction crew unknowingly disturbed the hill. A development project had been approved in the state capital miles away, but the blueprints got mixed up. A private company bulldozed a path up toward the old property, planning to build a cell tower. Within 48 hours, 3 workers quit without explanation. One of them was found later that week walking barefoot down a highway, his hands caked with dirt and his fingernails ripped off. He never spoke again. The project was abandoned. Local officials blamed budget cuts, but the men who had been on that slope refused to say what they saw, only that something was still alive up there, still moving, still watching. One man, a welder, scribbled a single line in grease pencil on the inside of his trailer wall: "He doesn't eat, he remembers." That year, a journalist from Knoxville named Aaron Marley tried to write a feature story on the topic: Appalachian Decay, Forgotten Families, the usual angle. She interviewed locals, heard the whispers, and even managed to track down the girl's Polaroid. But she made one mistake. She went up there alone. Her final recording was recovered from a melted cassette found in the glove box of her burnt-out sedan. The engine was still intact. No crash, no explosion, just fire. Experts called it spontaneous combustion, but on the tape, you can hear it. Her voice shaking, the wind howling, and underneath it all, barely audible, a scratching sound, not like an animal, but like bone on bark. Then silence. And then something wet, almost breathing. No words, just a presence. The tape ends with Aaron gasping, whispering a final phrase: "His mouth is open, but there's nothing inside." The fire marshal never filed a proper report. The ashes were buried, and Aaron's name was gone from the newsroom within a month. Her family stopped talking about her. Friends deleted her photos. It was as if she'd never existed. You see, that's what the craw does. He doesn't just end lives, he erases them. Memory, history, language, they unravel around him like a rope dipped in acid. If you're still watching, you're braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would do if this was your bloodline. Because if you trace your roots far enough, you might find soil that should have been left untouched. Some say he was the last of his kind. That when the bloodline finally folded in on itself, it produced something that was no longer human, but was nothing else either. The craw was less a man and more a consequence, a living punishment. But there is one story that still lingers among the oldest people, told only once, then never again. It comes from a nurse, an elderly woman now, who worked night shifts at a long-term care home 3 counties over. In 2004, they admitted a patient brought in by 2 silent men with government IDs. No name, no records, no insurance. The order was simple: keep him comfortable. She said the man was small and hunched, with limbs that were too short and fingers curled like dried worms. No tongue, no teeth, no vocal cords. Yet he moved with intent, slowly, as if each motion carried the memory of generations. And then there were the things he knew. He would sit by the window and turn his head at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night for weeks. Until one night, a patient in the next room died at exactly 3:17. He would trace shapes on the walls with his fingers, spirals, always spirals. The cleaning staff would paint over them every morning, but the next night they would reappear, slightly larger, slightly deeper. By the 3rd week, the paint had begun to bubble. The nurse said she once sat with him during a storm. With the lights out, only thunder, she swore he was listening to her thoughts. Her worst childhood memories surfaced unbidden, flashes of shame, fear, and guilt, until she could barely breathe. He just sat there blinking, breathing through the hole where a tongue should have been. When she asked him, trembling, "What are you?" he slowly lifted his hand and tapped the window 3 times. Outside, a tree lay dead, split down the middle by lightning. The next morning, he was gone. No discharge paperwork, no trace in the system. The room had been emptied, the bed stripped, the spirals gone, as if he had never been there. But she kept one thing: the pillowcase. A soft flannel with a bloodstain, not from a wound, but shaped almost perfectly like a hand. A hand with 7 fingers. And since then, she has never spoken of the mountains. She won't even look at maps. Because some things don't just die out, they wait. You'd think folklore would fade with time. But in places like this, places with bone-thin ridges and hollowed-out valleys, it festers instead. Not as bedtime stories, but as warnings passed in glances, in silences, in what's left unsaid. Because deep down, they know the craw was never a man. He was a scar shaped like one. One final story lingers, and it's one people refuse to write down. A park ranger, new to the area, decided to map old mining trails near the abandoned property line. His GPS pinged him as stationary for 3 hours, then went out completely. They found him 3 days later, barely alive, eyes wide and unblinking. He was seated upright against a tree with both hands jammed into the soil. When medics pulled him out, he didn't speak for 12 hours. Then he said one sentence: "There's another one. Not a man. Not the craw. Another one." The doctors wrote it off as shock, but they couldn't explain the pattern scratched into his forearms, long spirals that bled but never scabbed. Nor could they explain why, even under sedation, he kept trying to fold his fingers inward, breaking bones in the process, trying to mimic that unnatural 7-fingered curl. If the craw was the product of generations of decay, then perhaps something learned from him, or through him. That's the idea that haunts the locals more than anything else. He wasn't the end. He was a doorway, a signal, a rotten prayer whispered into blood and land until the land itself began to pray back. And now, decades later, people still whisper. Hikers who get lost on the ridges report hearing wet clicking sounds, like molars grinding, echoing off the bark. Trail cams catch blurred silhouettes that are too tall, too thin, with arms that dangle too low. Hunters return without a memory of the last 48 hours, and children in nearby towns are born with deformities not seen in 100 years. No one officially connects it, but the families know. They all moved west, leaving behind what they called bad land. But the land didn't forget them. Because somewhere out there, the craw still waits. Maybe not in flesh. Maybe not as one man, but as a pattern, an inheritance passed not through blood, but through silence. The final piece of this story isn't found in records or old photographs. It's buried in an unmarked grave behind a church that no longer holds services because no one dares to walk through its doors. Locals say the preacher who built it went mad, started speaking in riddles, said he was listening to the soil. That the dirt beneath the chapel was whispering stories not in words, but in shapes, spirals again, drawn in ash burned into the wooden pews and etched into his skin. They found him face down in the baptismal font, the water replaced by blood. His hands were clawed and stiff, his fingers broken inward, trying to hide something in his palms. When the coroner pried them open, he found only 7 smooth, small, wet rocks, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. No funeral was held. The body was buried quickly and quietly, not out of shame, but out of fear. Fear that whatever had touched him was still nearby, waiting for another soul to listen too closely, to believe too much. It's easy to dismiss all this as legend, backwards madness, inbred hysteria. But legends don't erase maps. They don't steal names from hospital records. They don't cause grown men to gnaw through their own tongues in padded rooms, screaming about the mouth that remembers. The truth is, something did live out there. Whether it was a man, or the echo of a man, or something twisted into the shape of a man, we'll never know for sure. But we let it happen. We looked away. We ignored the rot. And it grew in the walls, in the blood, in the names we forgot to bury properly. So now, if you ever find yourself driving through eastern Tennessee and the road becomes too quiet, if your radio goes dead, if your GPS starts spinning, if the forest seems to lean in as if it's breathing, turn around. Don't go looking for the house. Don't follow the spirals. Don't answer the silence, because silence is not safety. Silence is what he hears through. And somewhere out there, he still remembers your name. He's not coming for you. You've already arrived.